system of education from other children? If they do, are there any Northern teachers to implement that system? Hello, I'm Bob Harding from CBC Montreal. Today I want you to meet a few of the Northern educators involved in the teacher education workshop taking place at the McGill Centre for Northern Studies. Thanks to a generous grant from the Donner Foundation, the McGill Centre for Northern Studies in Montreal and the Kativik School Board of Northern Quebec are setting up a 4-year teacher training program for the Inuit teachers in the Northwest Territories. My first guest is the well-known linguist Mick Mallon, Director of Eastern Arctic Teacher Education. Mr. Mallon, what we'd like to get from you is more or less an overall picture of the education system in the North, in the Northwest Territories, and also the history of what's been happening up in the North for these last many years.
These last few years. We didn't really get going until about the 50s. In the 50s, Canada suddenly woke up to the fact that the Eskimos up there were real people instead of just myths, and that Canada had certain duties towards them. So the federal government started, both in Arctic Quebec and in the Northwest Territories, a school system which was basically, in our innocence, the importation of a southern system slapped into the North. People like me, with no training in teaching cross-culturally, with minimal training in the language, parachuted into little villages scattered throughout the North and given schoolrooms with lots of copies of Dick and Jane. Now, that's where we started from.
But what happened before the 50s?
Nothing. No, that's not true.
Was there an education system?
There was an education system that came from the culture itself. So that, I mean, the men learned how to be hunters and the women learned how to look after the furs and the rest of it. Now, if you're thinking of...
This was not enough? It wasn't valid?
It was completely valid for...
Survival?
For survival under those conditions, but the... Well, for example, the moment you come across a family that is dying of starvation, as people did, and you provide food, I mean, you've disturbed the balance. I was in Pavangatuk, for example, when the first houses were built. Now, there's no way that any human being who isn't insane would condemn himself to winter in an igloo. Not even so much winter, but spring and fall in an igloo when there's a house available. So once you start to bring these little serpents into the Garden of Eden, then everything else falls. As far as any kind of formal education was concerned, there were missionaries who ran part-time schools. There was one aspect of formal education, incidentally, started by the missionaries that in fact grew by itself, and that was the writing system, the syllabic writing system. And it's one of the ironies of the introduction of our educational system into the North that one of the first results was that a people who had been almost 100% literate in the Eastern Arctic, most Inuit could read their own language written in syllabics, became less literate because we managed to produce, for a brief period of time, we managed to produce some young people who did not know how to read their own language anymore and weren't particularly hot at reading our own.
I want to go back to the need for a formal education up north. Was this a cry on their behalf that they wanted this formal education?
No. There was... Before we arrived...
Or is it missionary style? We're going in to save them again.
Yeah, well, there was
as we've tried to do all over the world.
Yeah, but wait a minute. You see, there was certainly that point of view. But I also remember, I spent a couple of years in Borneo. And I got there in 1963, and one of the letters in the paper was from a land Dayak who said, when the British were in Borneo, the British put in a school system for the Malays to become government civil servants, and the British encouraged the Chinese to run their own educational system, but they decided to leave us alone in our unsullied innocence. And now that the Federation of Malaysia has started, we land Dayaks are left out in the cold because we don't know the tricks of the trade. So I think that unless the North could have been kept, well, you know what they called the policy in Borneo was the whipsnade policy, a zoo policy. And one of the native leaders, Tagak Curley, has actually talked about the North as a zoo where the happy Eskimos were left for like a national park. Now, unless Canada had decided to leave the North strictly alone, and that would mean letting any diseases that naturally occurred run their place, letting people starve to death. Unless we decided to do that, then we had to go the whole route. I think if you look, for example, if you look at the development of some of the young Inuit political leaders today, the ones who have survived our educational system, I think the ones who have survived have benefited from it. I find myself, I'm prejudiced, that Peter Itinuak, the MP from the Nunatsiaq, the only Inuk member of Parliament, I think he's one of the most articulate members of Parliament. So, although I'm aware of all the dislocation that our presence has caused, I think it was essential to try and get in some form of educational system. Having got that one in, it's now essential to change and to make it fit that situation better.
How's it going to change?
First, we have got to give control over people's education to the parents, to the people themselves. We've got a fairly centralized system. I'm talking particularly about the Northwest Territories. We've got a fairly centralized system, and gradually there is developing a handing over of power, a devolution into the hands of local education authorities. So that has to take place. And then it's not enough to give people the power to make decisions. They must also be given the information that enables them to make informed decisions. If there is a community that decides that all they want the school system to do is to teach English, well, then they should know the possible consequences of that. If they decide that they want the two languages to go side by side, they should know what kind of models to put into place. You need informed local control. You need material in the language to teach. Let's make the assumption people do want Inuk to be taught. And you need a core of native teachers trained to teach, to use that material.
Is all of that available?
Not yet. We're working on it, but not yet.
What's missing?
Vital elements of everything. We still do not have... And again, I'm talking my area is the Northwest Territories. We still do not have every Inuk member of every local educational authority fully aware of the options open to him. We still do not have enough material in Inuktitut for the teachers. We still do not have enough of a flow of trained Inuit teachers. And all of those three things have to be worked. We're working on them now.
What ways are you taking to work on this situation to improve it?
Okay, the first business, the business of the handing over control, of course, is basically a political decision, and as a civil servant, of course, I have got no influence on the political process. The second bit, the business of providing curriculum material. Well, you see, what's happened in the territories is that there's been a change in the racial composition of the Legislative Assembly in the last few years. There's now a preponderance of very persuasive native members, and the political push is very much toward development of native language programs. And I feel we're just on the crest of the wave that's about to break, and we are, I hope, in the next few years going to see much more native material being produced. We're also just past the point, we're starting to surf on the production of native teachers, thanks to the connection we've got with McGill, thanks to the growing connection with Caravic School Board of Arctic Quebec, and thanks, God bless them, to the Donner Foundation.
How did all of these things now meld together like this? What brought them all together, McGill with the Northwest Territories? And you mentioned that the Northwest Territories was more or less your part of the world. Aren't the problems common to all of the Northwest Territories, and also the other areas? Well,
of course, if you're right in the middle of them, you're very conscious of the differences. But if you step back a little bit, yes, it's one cultural unit. Arctic Quebec, right through the Northwest Territories, right into Alaska, back into Greenland. Now, the McGill connection. You see, in the Northwest Territories, academically, we're an orphan. There is no University of the Northwest Territories, there's no federal university, and the provincial universities are concerned with their own particular provincial responsibilities. So when we need academic help in the territories, we've got to go cap in hand to some university hoping that they'll be good enough to help us. However, any citizen of Quebec has got the right to demand academic assistance from a Quebec university. So when the people in the Caravic School Board in northern Quebec, when they faced the problem of training Inuit teachers to teach in Inuktitut to Inuit children in their schools, they automatically turned to McGill. And McGill proceeded to provide them with an umbrella for developing courses and professional help in developing courses. Okay, now in the meantime, while this was developing naturally in Quebec, what we had over in the territories, which is a much more heterogeneous grouping of different dialects of Inuktitut, different Indian languages, a much stronger, much larger white population, a group of Métis. What we had over there, what we had set up over there, was an imitation or a copy of a conventional teacher training system where native students were brought in and instructed in English how to teach in English and then sent back to the schools. Some of our young people from the Eastern Arctic would come back into an Eastern Arctic school and the principals would say, "Thank God you got here teaching Inuktitut," which is a little bit traumatic, eh? You made the switch here and the switch back here again.
They can't do it.
Well, actually,
Very few
some of them, yeah. Well, it was a bit of a strain. I've seen the strain, and I've also seen some tremendous teaching come out of it. But what a traumatic experience to go through. Now, some of us in the territories were determined to wrest that teacher training program into something that we felt fitted more the needs of the situation. And I mean, we're not just getting this from our heads, we're getting this back from graduates from the program, we're getting parents who are a little bit frustrated by the alienation of the system. Well, when we started to do this, I started off teaching in Arctic Quebec anyway, so we just found ourselves working hand in glove with Katowice, and therefore we find ourselves using the McGill umbrella. Now, so what you're getting is a convergence of two systems which started off historically different, but a convergence to meet the common task. And I should mention at this stage that one of the key differences in the Katowice program as opposed to the one that we'd been doing was Katowice is heavily involved in field courses, teaching out in the communities. Now, one of our problems in trying to recruit teachers is to try and persuade people to leave their communities, leave their families, because many of them are married, and come down to an institution for 2 years. And what we wanted to do was to give more courses out where the people were. And we were stymied, as you can imagine, with lack of funds. And that's where we had this breakthrough, this manna, just earlier last year, where the Donner Foundation gave a grant to McGill, which assists us to set up these courses out in the field.
Leena Twerdin is with me. She's from Frobisher Bay, and she's a senior instructor there. Leena, I want to ask you about the growing need for education and instruction in the Frobisher Bay area. We'll concentrate on the Frobisher Bay area.
You mean concerning TEP?
Yes.
Okay. Right now we have a bunch of students, which you call Inuit students, that are attending this TEP program for 1 to 2 years. We have 2 streams. We have one stream for 2 years and the other is for a period of only 1 year. And in the first stream we have students that were already classroom assistants. They were helping teachers in the classrooms. And they are in Frobisher at TEP for only a year. And in June they'll be graduating as qualified teachers. Because the reason why they are in Frobisher for a year is because they have enough experience in the classroom.
You now are in Montreal on a teacher education program, and I'd like to talk about the various teaching methods. You are here in Montreal learning, and you take what you've learned back to Frobisher Bay. Do you teach what you have learned here the same way it was taught to you?
Really, right now I'm not attending any course, but mainly I'm here is to make plans which course would be best for me to take first so I could teach, them at TEP. And
but you have taken courses
I've
in the
taken
South before.
courses. Yes, I've taken courses, but I couldn't possibly teach exactly the way I've been taught here in Frobisher to the students because of the difference in the language and the culture and the lifestyle.
You would adapt it to fit the people up there.
Mm-hmm.
What do you teach?
Well, I teach in my own native language, reading methods, language arts, and Inuktitut 1.
Inuktitut 1.
1 is mainly about linguistics and something like that.
How old would your students be? Or-
Well, they differ. Some are high school graduates, some are some have had jobs, but they wanted to become teachers, so they've come, and some are the ones I told you about, the CAs, the classroom assistants. And the age group might be from 17 to maybe 27, I'm not sure.
Is the student population increasing in Frobisher Bay?
Yes, it is.
More and more
Yeah,
Inuit people want to learn how to...
We have field-based programs now with the classroom assistants in the settlements. They come to one place, together, and are taught a university course from McGill or Evic for 10 days, and the course carries credits for their teaching certificate. And so for that, we get to have lots of students.
Both of you are involved now in this Inuit teacher education workshop taking place at McGill University, teaching 4 people in turn how to teach psychology to people up north. Am I wrong? Correct me if I'm wrong.
I wouldn't say that we're teaching so much as we're assisting them. We are not instructing them in how to. We're assisting them in developing the courses which they will teach.
And this is a course in child psychology. How children grow, how children learn, and how children behave. There are 3 areas.
3 courses.
3 courses.
Mm-hmm.
How would you aid the Inuit? Where would you start from? They are looking to teach a course in psychology on child behavior. Where do you two fit into all of this?
Well, we start with their ideas of, for example, how children behave, what we did this afternoon. Just a discussion among themselves. What problems, as teachers in your experience, have you met with kids in your classroom that you found difficult to handle, difficult to teach, where you were stuck? Make a big list of all of this. And then, what are the causes that we can think about? What are the solutions? What techniques or tricks or ideas have you found or have you heard about that might help? And then try and have a discussion about that. Most of the ideas will come from the teachers. Our job is to help them start to make a pattern, start to make a structure, so that it becomes manageable for them and they can go on and add other ideas. It's really a structuring and organizing kind of help.
Would you use something that is patterned in the South, and I mean Montreal, a child psychology course that's given in Montreal? Would you take that as a model and then vary that and apply it up north?
No. What we are essentially doing is helping them in ways of looking at behavior and child development, the whole field of child development, and then how they look at it. So given our model, is up to them. We don't say this is a course, this is what you should be adapting. What we are essentially doing is simply facilitating the process by showing them, if you look at problems, then look at the causes of problems, and then you can decide the solutions. And the materials, some of the materials have been developed here, but they have been developed for the North. And we are trying very hard not to impose our own perceptions or our own understanding even of child development.
How prepared are they when they come to a seminar or a workshop like this?
Well, we have 4 people at 4 different levels.
Yes.
There's one person who has been in teacher training for several years, has taught a long time, has a McGill teaching diploma, and has instructed in 3 different courses at this point. The second person who is almost finished her teaching diploma and is preparing to teach one of the courses that we're looking at here, the first one, How Children Grow. So this is very valuable for her. She's getting her planning done with 3 other helpers. And then there are 2 people who have taught a lot as assistants. You probably know more of their background. They haven't instructed on their own yet. One has assisted, another instructor, and one is going to be doing it for the very first time.
Do they have degrees? Yeah. Do they have psychology degrees?
No.
No.
It's not necessary?
No.
No?
Why would it be necessary?
Why wouldn't it be necessary?
If a teacher can gain a very practical knowledge of how a child operates, perceptually, with vision and hearing and so on, motor skills, language, thinking, on a very concrete level, there's no need for that teacher to understand what the man's name was that first came up with a certain explanation for how kids learn to see squares and triangles and circles.
I agree with you.
There's no need for that. A good teacher doesn't need that academic background necessarily. We get stuck in that in the South a lot in teacher training.
Yes.
Okay.
When they first came into the course, how open were they? How much did they contribute?
Very little at first.
Very little at first? How did you get them to more or less come out of that and start contributing and rounding off this course that they're supposed to teach, that they will teach?
Well, maybe step one, they sat in a class and had a Southern white person teaching with a translator standing beside him. That was some years ago, eh? Step two, that person who had been translating became a teacher rather than a translator and became involved with the white Southern instructor in presenting the course and started to learn more about it than the other people in the class. People in the class, some leaders emerged who were really interested, and a little group of people became kind of specialized in that particular course to the point where they prepared to teach it with a lot of help in planning from the white instructor who's now in the background as a consultant, and they did it together again to this point now where there are a number of people who are ready to do it basically on their own and are revising the planning with a lot of their own ideas and throwing out a lot of the structure that was back 5 years ago.
Now, as psychologists, both of you, what have you learned? Why can we not apply what we learned down here up there?
Because there are major differences in perception, in developmental sequencing, in accepted behaviors, and there's a whole heap of generalizations that we make that aren't necessarily true.
And that are quickly understood by us, but aren't understood.
One example that might help to explain the kind of difference that we see in children, and I think in the teachers that we're working with here. When we set about to teach a child a task, usually we start with the first little bit of that task, how to tie a shoe, and then a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more until finally the child can do the whole thing. But at the beginning he has no idea where it's going. He learns step one. And finally, after a long period of time, perhaps like in learning the alphabet, then he learns some words and he finally sees, oh, all this is so I can read. A more natural way in an Inuit situation is for the adult to do a task and leave the last bit undone for the child to do, and the child sees the thing done and finished. Gradually he'd leave out more and more, do it except for the last 3 steps, making a toy, something like that. A very, very different approach, and much more the child is there with the adult and watches and copies and learns by seeing do, rather than sit down and listen to me and I will tell you how to do this, which is much more our style even as parents.
But with Inuit children, traditionally they have learned by watching the entire action, not just the parts that we may instruct in school, but the whole thing, and observing it, and then maybe practicing on their own, but not being expected to practice in public or do it publicly until they have mastered it and feel comfortable and competent with it. It's a different approach to learning.
Inuit children seem to learn a lot incidentally without being taught it directly by teachers. So that, for example, in teaching an Inuit child to read, or any other subject, but reading is a good example, just by putting names and objects around the room without a lot of direct instruction, the child will notice this visually and pick it up. It can be used in a lot of different areas of learning too, without having to be sat down and told to do a specific task and practice. Changes in the environment that children notice, I find, much more than Southern children will on their own, because they've grown up learning on their own. Also, this difference between a straight line and something else that's not a straight line. I think because of our educational background, most of us feel that if we can go in a straight line from step 1, step 2, step 3, this happens, and this happens, and this happens, we understand it. If we can put it in a line, it's clear. That's not necessarily true. We're simplifying the world terribly by doing that. But an Inuk teacher and an Inuk child, I think, wouldn't have the same compulsion unless they'd had the experience in a southern school of being trained that way, to put it in a line. If we can get a grasp of the whole picture, this little part here, we can study and put it back in. This little part here, put it back in.
Could we talk very briefly about behavioral patterns, social and also emotional?
Well,
the differences. Maybe we could start off with the differences.
Well, there are probably a lot of differences, a lot of which we're not aware of yet, we don't know, because it's very difficult to fully understand somebody else's culture and behavioral patterns. But an example, and something that I learned by working with these and other Inuit teachers was, for instance, that some of our assumptions about the causes of behavior and how childbearing and so on affects adult behavior is the example of an abused child. And our common knowledge says that if a child is abused, he's likely to grow up to be an abusing parent. But in Inuit society, at least with the people that I've worked with, it doesn't work that way, that the abused child is the one who grows up to be the most caring, loving, good parenting adult.
Why?
We can draw conclusions, but there's a lot more work has to be done before we will know.
And we're probably not the ones that are going to explain some of these things. They will once they're out in the field doing their own observing. The way that this whole process began in my involvement in Quebec was the need for a psychology course or a course in testing intelligence and all of these things that have to be part of a school system, and people saying, we can't do that. What we can do instead is help the Inuit teachers gain skills to go and carefully observe their own children and try and explore some of these things and find some of these answers, so that we are not imposing on them rules for behavior, rules for good development and poor development that are based on our ideas, because like Bronwyn's example, we can be exactly wrong, completely the opposite may be true in many cases.